Yeah.
Okay, so welcome everyone to this week's edition of the Great Minds, Great Problems seminar hosted by the Department of Social Sciences. My name is Yuri Mansouri. In case you don't know me, I'm an associate professor of social sciences for Illinois Tech. I want to thank Professor Hao Huang, who is the faculty in charge of organizing the Great Minds seminar, and also to Professor Jeff Terry, the chair of the Social Science Department, for his continuing support of the webinar series. Our guest today is Professor Bill Rand, and he is a full professor of marketing at the Poole College of Management at North Carolina State University, where he is also the university faculty scholar. Bill Rand's areas of expertise are social media, misinformation, machine learning, and agent-based modeling. He examines the use of these computational modeling techniques in addition to natural language processing and geographic information systems, GIS, to help understand and analyze complex systems, such as the diffusion of information, organizational learning, and economic markets. He has also worked on creating pedagogy and building frameworks to allow researchers and practitioners to use analytics and data-intensive methods in their own work. His research has received funding from the National Science Foundation, DARPA, stands for Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, Google, and the Marketing Science Institute. Bill's work has been published at some of the very top journals in his field, including the Journal of Marketing, Journal of Marketing Research, Management Science, and Journal of Operations Management. Bill Rand received his doctorate in computer science from the University of Michigan in 2005. And prior to coming to NC State, he was at the University of Maryland for 8 years. His talk today is titled Adversarial Social Media. Among other things, he's going to discuss how adversarial actors, have distorted the conversations happening in a social media platform, and how we can talk about recent efforts to combat adversarial social media. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Bill.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction, Yuri. And I got to acknowledge, part of the reason why I'm here is that Yuri and Yuri actually happened to attend a class that I taught on agent-based modeling as part of the ICPSR summer programs. That's the institute up at University of Michigan that teaches a group of summer programs on social science research. Highly recommend it if you're interested in these topics. But yeah, let me dive right in. Social media is a topic I've been studying almost since I've been a professor, essentially. I started researching social media around 2008 to 2010. Even before that, I was interested in social networks and how informal social networks affect people's decision-making processes. But I have become worried about, as many of us have, about the growth of adversarial social media, which is what I'll use to generally describe the use of social media for nefarious purposes in many respects, right? And let me talk about some examples. So, for instance, misinformation is growing rampant in today's social media space. Conspiracy theories and misinformation have existed forever, but social media enables users to kind of take that information and align and identify pockets of information that just align with their own belief systems, right? This allows for them to then, for adversaries to kind of perpetuate misinformation in those space. And it enables more rapid spreading of information. In fact, some of the remedies that we'll talk about have to do with just slowing down that spread. Social media, though, I should mention, I always like to mention this. I mean, part of the reason why I've been studying social media for so long is I'm very interested in the positive uses of social media. How can social media be used to preserve the voices of minorities and people who might not be heard from otherwise, right? We have social media to thank for things like the Arab Spring, the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, and many of these kind of other aspects that if social media didn't exist, we would not even be aware of. some examples of things we might have seen. Giuliani, of course, has been parading a series of false voter claims, and as has his boss at the time, Trump, did as well, right? And the quote unquote big lie that we see considerably spread throughout social media. We've seen around the pandemic, we saw tons of fake information being spread, including this virologist by the name of Judy Mikovits, who pushed this thing called the plandemic, about how the COVID-19 vaccines were actually, or sorry, COVID-19 virus was actually planned and being used by the government to control us, right? No evidence to any of these claims, by the way, right? This is an interesting one, right? There was a claim circulating during the pandemic that the medical strip in medical mask was actually a 5G antenna being used to track where people are and to listen in on their information. You might think that that's silly, but it's such a claim that this was actually an AP Presswire release explaining that it's not, in fact, the truth, right? That this is not an antenna, right? And of course, this has also invaded quote unquote meme culture, right? With people using this to spread misinformation within the meme space. I don't wear my mask for me, I wear it for you, darling. Don't drag me into your psychosis, right? Like, these kind of ideas is continuing to spread around us. In fact, many people would argue that these kind of conspiracy theories and this misinformation has gone back for quite a while, to the days of flat Earth theories, arguing that the world is not round but instead flat. What's interesting about that is that we've seen rebirth of flat Earth theory recently, right? And you might be curious, why is that? Well, there's actually a pretty natural explanation. The one thing we know about conspiracy theories, when you look at the social science literature, is that if someone believes one conspiracy theory, they are more likely to believe others, right? And so if people start to believe conspiracy theories around, say, electoral voting, the pandemic, vaccines, even the vaccine stuff before the pandemic vaccine, about vaccines causing autism, right? They are more likely to believe things like the earth is flat, right? Like, that we know that from studying the psychology of how these kinds of things spread. When you get down to the vaccines, right, there's been discussions about whether or not Bill Gates planted trackers in the vaccines, right, which I'm not exactly sure how that theory started, but it's one that people seem to grasp onto quite a bit. And so all these are different kinds of misinformation and conspiracy theory aspects, some of which will argue the causes. We know that some of them are motivated by financial causes. There are people who promise remedies, right, like remdesivir as a solution for COVID-19, and then made money off of prescriptions being filled related to remdesivir, right? And so some of these are financially motivated. Some of them are politically motivated. We know that the Internet Research Agency, which is the IRA based out of Russia, deliberately spread misinformation during the 2016 and 2020 elections, trying to disrupt liberal democracies in the United States. They also did the same thing in France, in Denmark, and other places as well, right? Trying to capitalize on Russian goals, right? So there's been a number of different motivations for this. How do we fight against it? That's really the question, right? I think that there's a number of different ways they're really captured in the literature. We can identify it. First of all, how do we spot fake news? I think one of the things that's fascinating about the growth of fake news and misinformation is that we've seen a resurgence in education around sourcing of news articles in our school system. So elementary school children, and K through 12 children are now being taught to think more critically about where their information is coming from. I think we should step these up, but it's nice to see that it's happening to somewhat. We can educate people about how to recognize misinformation, right? So this is part of a online game that allows you to kind of play the role of someone spreading misinformation. And one of the things that's interesting is that they actually did a scientific study and showed that people who play this game are less likely to then spread misinformation themselves, right? And so just by educating people about the fact that people have different desires to spread misinformation allows you to kind of identify it and then combat against it. You could decrease the ease of finding misinformation on social media. So this is something that a bunch of the companies did. Pinterest is probably a great example where they actually started. They only allow you to see information from health sources when searching for things related to vaccine and other health issues. And I put up the picture of Nickelback here, particularly because Nickelback being hit with rocks is not something you want to find when you're searching, if you're a fan of Nickelback, when you want to search for the phrase Nickelback rocks, right? This is in fact making fun of Nickelback, this video, right? What did they do to combat it? Well, as I teach in my digital marketing classes, one of the best solutions is to create new content that pushes down this, in this case, misinformation of a kind of funny sort in some respects, right? But this allows us to kind of control the narrative, allows us to increase the amount of positive information, correct information being spread. I should say, I don't want to push the social media companies under the bus. Facebook, Twitter, all these kinds of examples of the spread of misinformation. They are aware of it. Some of them probably acting slower than they should. The Facebook papers that came out a couple of years ago really showed that off. But some of them have taken positive action. So, for instance, Twitter decided to add a function. So now, if you go to retweet an article, you have to say, are you sure you want to retweet that? Have you read the article first? You don't have to read it, but just that little step has been shown to decrease the spread of misinformation. In this particular case, the particular article I was pushed the retweet button on was about different flavors of Oreos. So I'm not really sure if there's many misinformation issues there, but it's interesting that they've enacted that on all the articles that come out, right? There is a business interest side of this too. I would be remiss, I know that this is for a social science audience, so generally some of these might not be, the business interest isn't necessarily on the forefront, but there is a business interest to this, and as a business professor, I can't ignore it, right? Social media is a popular platform for marketers and organizations to diffuse and spread their content, their advertising message. And some of this influence is perpetrated not just by humans, but also by bots. In fact, I just gave a lecture today in my class about an article about follower factories. These ideas that there are these creations out there where people can generate factories of followers, and these automated users can then be used to launch campaign attacks against brands, right? So, for instance, Nestle, Harley Davidson, and AMD have all suffered attacks, brand attacks, that we think were primarily under the control of bots. A classic example is that during the 2018 election, 2018 midterms, Harley Davidson CEO had to come out and say that he did not call President Trump an idiot, because that rumor had started circulating, we think mainly perpetrated by bots, that he had done so and he had to take a stance. So brands do suffer consequences from these kind of adversarial attacks. Detecting adversaries. So what can we do about this, right? So I've started to try and focus research along these lines. One of the early things that we started looking at was detecting adversaries. How do we detect bots, and how do we know that they're out there? And potentially, once we know that they're there, start to think about ways we can combat them. So, as an example here, I have a bot that we know is a bot. This Denim McSparron, who this company Talent, we don't know for sure, but the Talents Inc. may have purchased the use of to retweet any tweet that they issue. This one's interesting because it looks like they only purchased one bot, and then they retweeted everything that they said, right? So in joint work with Anthony Weishampel, who's now a data scientist at PepsiCo, and Anna Maria Staiku, who is a professor in the statistics department here at NC State, one of our goals was to create a tool that models user behavior and helps marketers identify malicious users, malicious social media users. Now, there's been a bunch of work in this. In fact, so much work that Kresge, who's one of the experts and who I'll talk about later, recently issued an article called 10 years, a decade of social bot detection, right? Where they went through all the different methods of how people have identified bots. So one of the ways we wanted to look at, Anna Maria is an expert in time series analysis. So we were interested, could the time series of when the bots were tweeting or posting content on social media tell us anything about whether or not they're bots, right? So, other methods that have existed out there include things like using identifying profiles, identifying pictures, identifying posting behavior. But what we noticed is that there were behavioral differences observed in the time between posts, the sequence of the types of events, and the number of posts that were present. And so a lot of these other methods that looked at the language people used or looked at the profile images, they're very computationally intensive, right? They require a lot of effort. One of the most popular methods actually looks at that's deployed by a tool called Bot or Not, actually looks at the social network of the bot or potential bot and all of its interactions to try and detect if it's a bot. The problem with that is it's very expensive to pull down all that data. It costs a lot of effort to pull that data in. So we wanted to try and figure out a method that was maybe a little easier for marketers to use and a little less computationally expensive. So we looked at a bunch of data. We looked at social media bots, and there's a Kresge et al. Paper that has labeled social media bots that have existed in the past. We also, Twitter is helpful and actually goes through and every so often identifies a set of bots that it thinks are being operated by, or it has evidence to believe, are being operated by a foreign government to disrupt elections. And this could be elections in the US, it could be elections in the Netherlands, France, any country in which they're trying to disrupt the elections. And it will remove those bots, but it will post the history of what those bots have said so that we can analyze it, right? And so we were able to pull this data down and start to look at the time series of when the bots had tweeted or not, right? And try to determine, is there a pattern of when bots post content that we can use to more successfully label bots as what they are, as bots, right? So here's an example of, I always like to look at these. So every row here is a day, and every column is a half-hour time period within that day, right? And if it's dark, that means the person did not tweet during that day, right? And if it's lighter, it means they did tweet during that day. Oh, sorry. Every row here is not a day. Every row here is a user, and the columns are the time of a particular day that we looked at, right? And just from looking at this, you can see right off the bat that the bot users, which are on the right-hand side, have a very different posting pattern than the genuine users, right? They all post between the hours of, in Eastern time zone, between the hours of 3 a.m. and 9 p.m., right? They don't post outside of those, and they post pretty consistently within those time periods, right? Whereas genuine users are kind of all over the place, right, in what they're doing. Just some additional examples of daily trends. This is now, so each of these is an individual user. The rows are now days, the columns are time of the day. And you can see that there's a very different pattern between the genuine users and the bots. And we can continue to look at this. So this is a little bit different. This is now, we're looking at the genuine users. We're looking at the bots, which we were looking at the previous two slides. But then we're looking at two quote unquote foreign states. We believe that one of these foreign states was Russia and one was China, and their efforts to kind of manipulate democratic elections in some respects. Though we don't know that 100%, but just based upon evidence of some of what they're saying, we believe that be the case. By the way, if you have any questions or concerns, I do have all the screens up so I can kind of look at everything and see questions coming in as to what's going on as I'm giving the talk. So let me know if you have any questions. But what's interesting about this is you can clearly see the bots have a unique pattern of posting. genuine users have a different pattern. The foreign state actors seem to have similar patterns. One of them seems to be a little bit better than the other in terms of disguising their behavior. Foreign state 2 seems to have a very distinctive pattern that might be easily identifiable. Foreign state 1 may be a little bit harder to identify, right? So we're going to use a technique known as functional data analysis that allows us to kind of look at these time series of posting and then try and pick out what aspects are there patterns in this behavior that are generalizable enough that we can make predictions as to whether or not they are bots or not, right? And what we found, so on the top, what we see the probability, essentially, is one way to think of it, of a person posting at any particular time. And for the genuine users, it's kind of all over the place. Whereas for the bot users, which is the lower graph, the probability function becomes quite collapsed, right? And we then use a series of methods using functional data analysis, which essentially takes a discrete set of data and places a continuous curve across it to kind of come up with a estimate of the behavior of the user. And we can combine through by taking a group of those users, pull apart how likely a unknown user is to post if they are a bot versus not a bot at various time periods, right? And then we can use support vector machines to kind of classify whether or not that unknown user is in one of those two categories, a bot or not, essentially, right? The first two kind of principal components, eigenfunctions of this particular analysis, show us that they explained over 90% of the variance between the individuals. And what we found is that the bots were very, very likely to post, this is the black line, during business hours, the kind of 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. or a little bit earlier time period, whereas they were not expected to post during those non-business hours, which is the red dashed line that we see. And that's essentially what the component, the eigenfunctions tell us about the posting behavior. So then using that, those descriptions, we can then train a model to classify users in one of these two categories, right? And what we found is that we were very easy in the simple case of just genuine users versus bots to quickly come up with a method to classify these users. In fact, it classified it almost too well, it turned out, in the end, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through this. When we took those unknown users, as you can see here, there's only a few that they were misclassified. We were able to correctly classify with an F1 score, which is a combination of precision and recall at a rate of 0.986. And we're comparable to methods that use much stronger, much more data intensive methods. All we have to do is read in the last, in fact, we don't even need 30 days, but the last 30 days of activity about any user, and we can make a quick decision as to whether or not they're a bot or not. The botometer tool, among others, requires you to pull down a bunch of information from social media to make that decision. And so our method is cheaper and in some ways faster than these other more traditional methods out there. So as I mentioned, it turned out we were really, really, really accurate when we gave all the data to the bot detection routine that we had built. So we decided to look at varying the number of days, and we decreased the number of days that we were looking at. And we found that even down to a number of 3 days, we had a fairly high accuracy, 96.76% accuracy of classifying whether or not a particular unknown user was a bot or not, right? So we didn't need too much information in order to make these classifications fairly well. This kind of indicates the power of what could happen with just using these simple time series signatures to classify bots or not in this space. It works really well for this particular type of social bots, I should say. It turns out for the foreign state actors, those results I don't have here, but they're in our longer paper that was recently published. We found that some of them are hard to classify, but they're still easier than you would expect. And part of the reason why, if you look back at this data set, is that just these regularities of pattern of behavior for foreign state actors results in them being somewhat easy to classify. And that makes sense. We almost, because of the very nature of these actors, they have to work together, right? A foreign state actor that's trying to adversely affect social media conversations has to be coordinated with other foreign state actors, which means they need to be posting around the same time. If they don't, they're kind of lost among the noise of social media. So we really think that these time series signatures have the ability to kind of make a lot of inroads. Now, we'd love to look at additional users. We'd like to look at and create our own adversarial bot and try and use what's called an adversarial approach, where we train the bot to beat the detector and vice versa, to see if we can come up with a better and better detection scheme in this, and look to see how we can explore that. So I'm gonna pause there for a second. That is on bot detection. I'm about to move into a different type of content, which is on predicting the spread of misinformation. But if there are any questions, I'm happy to pause for a second before I move on.
Yeah, so just for clarification, the bots that you detected, are they actually real bots or the bots that you created for your
So no,
research?
these are real bots. These are like in wild bots. Kresge wrote a paper a while ago where he looked at bots, and we used his bots as the gold labels. His bots, essentially, they were things that his program had detected as being bots. He then reached out to find out if they were bots, right? And was never able to establish any kind of human contact whatsoever with them, right? And there was enough suspicion around the activity. Like, for instance, one of them was a user who was tweeting song lyrics and then suddenly started tweeting about an Italian city mayoral race, right? Randomly in the middle. And the song lyrics they were tweeting were country western lyrics in the Southeast United States, right? So this kind of switch, it looks like it's pretty indicative of bot activity. And Kresge did everything he could to confirm that it was a bot. And so we take that as a gold standard. With the Twitter bots, right? We don't actually know if they're bots. We know they're malignant users. They could have been operated by real humans, right? But they were someone who was trying to act in a way to disrupt democratic conversations, right? And so Twitter specifically labeled them. So we also take those as the gold standard. So when I'm talking about bots, I'm not talking about ones that we think or suspect are bots. I'm talking about actual bots that have been labeled that way beforehand. Yeah.
Thank you. Samrat has a question. Would you like to?
Yeah. So my question is like, your study is basically about bots. So do we have a spread of misinformation and conspiracy theories in a more organic way through human or genuine users? For example, not on Twitter, but say on YouTube. Suppose I post a YouTube video based on my knowledge of what vaccine is, and then it can attract a lot of comments and all those things. So that could also lead to some kind of misinformation, spread of misinformation, development of conspiracy theories. So that process would be different as compared to spread of conspiracy theories through bots. What is
that definitely happens. And that part of it, we initially started with just bots, right? But towards the end, we were also just generally looking at organized collective behavior that was intended to disrupt something, right? So for instance, on YouTube, and this isn't necessarily on like flat earth theory, conspiracy spreading, but when people post something positive but controversial to another group, there's been evidence that people will actually organize usually these are in Telegram groups, because those are end-to-end encrypted and locked up. They will organize the fact that they're going to attack the YouTube channel at a certain time. So a group of, you're completely correct, organic users will go in and try and spread misinformation. A lot of times this is around things like gay rights and LGBTQ questions and things like that, where someone is posting a positive message about them on YouTube, and then people who, for whatever reason, have hatred in their lives and decide that they don't believe in those things, will then come together as a group, usually in a Telegram room, but it can happen in Facebook rooms and stuff like that too as well, and then go online and post content again. That activity would also be detectable through some of the methods we're talking about, because it's synchronized behavior, right? Anything where we have this kind of synchronized behavior where they're all acting at the same time, would be something we'd be able to detect whether or not it was by a bot. I should say, beyond that, there are other things that we're going to talk about in a little bit that are work that we're doing in terms of detecting spread of conspiracy theories and things like that. So for sure, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I should say the bots are not the only cause of this, but they definitely accelerate what's going on, and they continue to perpetuate it. And so, a first step is kind of addressing the bot question in many respects. Any other questions before we move on to the next little piece? Okay, well, let me go ahead then. So, obviously we can know who these adversarial users are, but something else that might be helpful for us to know is where are they going to go next, right? If there's users who are on Twitter, right, can we predict what kind of misinformation spread they're going to spread about, right? Like what hashtag are they going to jump on? What kind of content are they going to push? So I was involved in a large project that went over 5 years with DARPA to study the spread of misinformation. And for this, we actually used the toolkit that originally Yuri and I met up about, which is agent-based modeling. So we built a large-scale agent-based model of social media. And the way we did this is there's historically been a lot of work done on information diffusion on social media. But for the project that DARPA was asking us for, it wasn't enough. It wasn't the models that had already been built would not work, essentially, right? A lot of the models of information diffusion that existed looked at one piece of information spreading through a network, right? Or they looked at they didn't make any assumptions about the users on social media, right? About what content they might like, what content they might be more willing to spread. And it didn't allow for users to change the information at all. So we had to build a new model, a new diffusion model, which derived from a model called the independent cascade model. And the independent cascade model essentially says that anytime one of my friends on social media posts a piece of content, I have some small probability of sharing a similar piece of content or retweeting that content, right? We then built upon theories of conversation theory, which is a theory promulgated by a social scientist by the name of Pask in the 1970s, to look not just at I'm aware that this information is out there and I'm spreading it, but also how do people modify that information, right? And essentially what we did was we wound up decoding all the effects on people's decision to spread a new piece of information into 3 possible buckets. The first we call internal relationships, right? Which we use the letter, historically this is given the letter Q, which references if more of my friends on social media are posting about a particular topic, then I am more likely to post about that topic, right? And that effect we call Q is sometimes called the internal effect because it's internal to social media, right? Or it's called the imitation effect because I'm imitating social media, right? I'm imitating something that someone else is saying. The second effect we're going to talk about is P, which is the exogenous effect. This is the fact that I post something on social media because I read about it on the news, or I just think about it, or I see it from some source outside of the social network. Maybe I get an email, right, for instance. And then the third effect that causes people to spread misinformation that we looked at was the internal effect. I just think that this is the way the world is. I just believe that the earth is flat. And so I'm going to post a piece of content about why the earth is flat, right? And so by decomposing the diffusion process into these 3 different components, we were able to model all of them in a large empirical network. So essentially, this is joint work with some colleagues at the University of Central Florida, including Ivan Garbe, Chadika Gunaratne, Nisha Baral, Chadra Jayav, and Chadarani Sanaviratna. And they helped me build this model and helped influence it quite a bit. So one way to think of it is you have an agent who has beliefs, desires, and interests, right? That agent is affected by the external forces, the innovation, the newspapers that they read, the Fox News that they watch, right? Whatever it is, and internal forces, what else they read on social media, right? What else they see on social media. And with that, they can make decisions and they can take actions either in the external world, which we don't really look at too much, but it's theoretically possible to model, or in the internal world of the social network, right, and affect what's going on there as well. So the basic idea was we set up these agents in a network. We are in the big thing that we're going to do is we're going to create relationships between each of the users we see on social media and all the other possible users on social media, not by looking at their follower network, in other words, who they follow or who they friend on social media, but rather by looking at what other agents on social media are most likely to influence them to take an action. And to do this, we use a notion of something called transfer entropy. So transfer entropy allows us to measure the effect of any one time series on any other time series, right? And so we can look at all the posts that come in from a particular user and all the posts that come in from a focal user and say, hey, when that other user posts, is that more likely to result in this user posting or not, right? And if it is, we can draw a connection between them, right? And so we build this kind of endogenous social network that is not based upon what people explicitly say their friends are, but rather based purely upon their public posting capability, right? What's nice about this is that a lot of times, for instance, bots won't follow each other on social media because they don't want to be seen as being part of this network, right? But they'll all follow the same 5 users, right? And so they use them as a coordination capability, and we can detect that automatically. But even genuine users, we can see this as well, right? Like if every time your crazy uncle posts, somebody deep within the Trump organization posts, right? We can detect that relationship on social media, right? What we have to look at, and what was interesting about this is, as you might imagine, there's way too much content posted on social media for us to actually look at all of the interactions between these users, right? And so we had to build a model of what we'll call working memory, right? And working memory allows us to look at, of the posts that people see, what actions, what posts are they likely to take action on? What are going to influence them to actually do something on social media? And of course, and one way to think of it is that notifications on social media are part of what Belk and others refer to as the theory of extended self, right? We no longer are just our brains. We're our brains plus all the stuff that we use to keep track of our daily lives, right? And that can include apps, that can include notebooks that we write notes in, it can include a whole bunch of other stuff. Really, that is who we are, right? And so on social media, notifications that one of our friends just posted are an example of an extended self, right? So that plus the idea that we can only look at so many posts, theory of working memory, this is the famous 7 plus or minus 2 notion of how many numbers you can keep track of. That tells us what we're likely to respond to in many of these cases. And so we call this idea, when we combine these 2 notions, an extended working memory, our ability to process these. We still can't act on every notification we get on Twitter, but we can act on more notifications than we can, for instance, the number of digits we could memorize or something like that, right? So how do we determine this? Well, initially, what we thought was messages come in, we have some sort of capacity to process messages. We can look at what that capacity is, right? And then we forget some messages because there's just too many for us to take care of, right? There's too many for us to take action on. And so we prioritize certain messages over others, right? And so when we initially built the model, we decided to just make it a first in, first out queue. In other words, if we hadn't taken action on a message and it was getting old, we would just throw it away and we wouldn't look at it anymore, right? But the question became, well, maybe that's not the case, right? There's a lot of other things out there that we could use to prioritize social messages, right? For instance, if we're good friends with a particular user, we might prioritize their messages over another. If they're talking on a topic that we normally talk on, we might prioritize their message over another, right? If there is a popular user right? Kim Kardashian posts, we might prioritize their message over another, right? Or maybe unpopular messages, right? What we found, just to kind of give you the kind of shortcut up front, is that recency, how recently the post was posted, how unpopular the person was, and lack of common interest and reciprocity drove response prioritization. Why unpopularity? Well, our theory is that people who are we see this in other studies as well, in other literature, is that when people are very popular, people realize that their posts are seen by lots of other people. So people know that when Kim Kardashian posts, lots of people see that post. So they're not going to resend that same information out again because of the fact that they think it's already been seen by lots of people, right? So people who are less popular are more likely to get reposted by your average user, right? Also, people are aware that users who have diverse interests from their own are more likely, that their network is less likely to have seen that information already, so they're more likely to share that information, right? And then there is a norm of reciprocity on social media. So if someone retweets me, I'm likely to retweet them, right? And we see that quite a bit in the data. So how do we find out that these were important? Well, the way we found it out is we thought about all the different ways that people could decide who to repost or who to post again, and how to prioritize the queue of information they were looking at. We looked at, as I mentioned, recency. We looked at, are there a lot of users participating in the conversation? We looked at how long the conversation had been going on. We looked at the magnitude of common interest. We looked at the popularity of URLs. Is this pointing to the New York Times, or is it pointing to a fake news website, right? We looked at how often I had posted a URL from the same location before. And we looked at a number of different other issues, right? And what we did was, just to explain a little bit about the method, is we built this agent-based model that we knew was predicting fairly well what was going on already within social media. And then we modified it to allow it to have agents use all these different rules, right? And so we allowed them to use any combination of these rules. And we ran that model thousands of times to try and figure out which of these rules seem to best match the underlying data that we saw, right? And so what I'm about to show you is a method that basically unpacked which of those rules seem to have the most effect on getting good results. And by far, the most important was recency. So our first in, first out queue that we talked about before is probably a fairly good rule, right? After that, the popularity of the initiator, though it turns out in a negative way, was the next most important. And then the mutual interest was the next one after that. And then we get into some combinations. This graph on the right shows what the actual values are that seem to do well, right? So for recency, it was high positive values that seemed to do very well. For the popularity of the user, it was actually negative values, which is why I was saying that unpopular users do better than non-popular users in spreading their messages, right? Or being retweeted or shared, I should say, not necessarily spreading, because a popular user obviously spreads their message while it's seen by lots of users, right? Mutual interest was also negative values, usually, right? The green areas is what you want to look at. And reciprocity was positively valued, right? In fact, what we found was that the method that had the lowest average error, in other words, the one that predicted the best as to what people were likely to talk about in the future, was a fairly complex relationship between recency and the popularity of the user at a negative, the mutual interest, and the reciprocity norm that we talked about. But I should say, recency by itself was not statistically significantly different than that model that we talked about, right? So the average value, the root mean squared error of the average root mean squared error was lower for this more complex equation, but just that recency one got you within a statistically significant result of that method, right? So I think that, going forward, if we want to actually model social media disinformation and its spread, we need to build these more complex and realistic models of social media, right? And understand where they're going. And a general model like this can help provide us with insights into human behavior on social media and how information diffusion continues to exist. this is not the only work I'm doing in this space. I want to mention, I wanted to kind of do a dive into two deep areas, but I wanted to mention a couple other areas that I've been working on. One is identifying threats in images and videos automatically. Most of the content on social media nowadays is not text. It's actually videos or images, right? And in fact, we've seen that even if in the world in which there's text, video and images are more engaging, right? So what we've done is started to build tools to automatically identify threats that might be existing. Now, these are examples, weapons and burning of flags that might be a little more obvious, right? In some respects, but we've also seen some very subtle examples. For instance, there is a tendency by members of white nationalist groups to do things like post pictures of individuals, and for the Jewish individuals in the picture, tint the face color to a bluer color for some reason. That's a signal that the white nationalists have come about to indicate their anti-Semitic views, right? And so detecting this is a lot harder than detecting something like a weapon in an image, for instance, right? Or, subtle symbols around the OK symbol, for instance, that's being used by white nationalists, right? Or the Nazi symbols that have been used at various times are harder to detect in social media, but we're working along those lines, right? So that's in identifying threats in images and video. Another area, that we've been playing around with and looking at is the potential use of geolocated data for adversarial attacks, right? And this is on social media in a variety of ways. So for instance, this was motivated partially by some stuff that was coming out where it turns out adversaries were looking at Strava data, which Strava is a fitness app that allows you to chart your runs and things like that. It turns out that soldiers in places like Afghanistan and Iraq were not Iraq because the Iraq war was over by then, but in Afghanistan for sure, were using Strava to plot their runs around bases, which then gave people on those apps a very nice outline of a US military base in a location that was supposed to be top secret, right? So what we've been doing is for the Army in particular is looking at geolocated data that we can purchase from commercial providers of that data, and then seeing, could an adversary use this to predict where our military is or where they're moving to? Or, from the flip side, could the military or the US government use this to predict a violent uprising that is about to occur or something like that around a sensitive point like a military base? So this is actually Okinawa data that we were actually, and this is kind of scary. We literally just went to a company, and I'll leave the company nameless because as you'll see, I'm about to impugn them a little bit. And we just said, hey, we want a bunch of data for Japan. We're thinking about using your services to geolocate data. They literally gave us 3 weeks worth of millions of data points around Japan for geolocated users in that space for free, with no restrictions or anything on it. And this is the data that we looked at for the Kadena Air Base in Okinawa. And those red points, every time you see a red point, that's a user, we don't know who it is, opening up a particular app on their phone that tracks their location. And this is just for the 2 weeks, 2 week period that we were looking at, right? So clearly we have a lot of information, and what we've been able to show is we can actually do a pretty good job of predicting whether or not someone is likely to come onto base or be near the base at a particular time period in the future, given their past history on geolocated data, right? Anyways, in general, I'll wrap up now. We'd love to examine adversarial social media attacks. We first need to be able to identify them, which is what the bot identification stuff that we're doing is working on. To understand them, we need more robust models of social media diffusion. The hardest part, the next goal, would be really to combat these. And we've launched a couple of efforts in this space. One, for instance, in which we started tweeting at people who had interacted with bots and adversaries and asked them why they had. And the goal was not to get them to respond. The goal was to see if we identify bots, does that decrease the amount of interactions people have with bots in the future? And we didn't find anything there, honestly, to tell you the truth. Not sure if that was an inconclusive research result or if people just are committed to interacting with bots, right? But we're trying to figure out how to combat this. In another paper I'm working on right now, we've actually shown that not only can we identify bots, but we can identify people who are likely to interact with bots before they actually do, right? So a question comes out then naturally, if those results hold out, could we intervene with those people before they interact with the bots and then make them less likely to interact with bots and adversaries, right? And that's something we're working on right now in many respects. So this is all future work, but I'd love to thank you for your time and attention. If you want to reach out to me, you can reach me at wmranda@ncsu.edu. I'm also on Twitter, at least until Elon Musk kicks me off. It's at Bill Rand. You can reach me there. And we also have the Business Analytics Initiative, which I run and does this kind of research, is available up there on the websites. So with that, I'll wrap up. And if there's any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Thank you, Bill. So at this time, I'm going to open the floor for questions and answers. You can do it in two ways. You can unmute yourself and speak directly on a microphone, or you can post your questions on the chat. So while
Bill,
waiting for, go ahead, please.
So Bill, I have a question which is not much related to your work, but kind of how to like where to publish. So as a business school professor, because I also try to do these kind of technical works, especially on social media modeling with different kind of phenomena on social media. So I can see that you generally publish in you also publish in business journals like ABDC and all. But what are some of the most like your favorite journals which would be acceptable towards this kind of work?
Yeah, that's a great question. And let me stop share so we could talk about this a little bit, right? I think one of my favorite journals right now. Actually, I haven't published there yet, but I really like the stuff they publish in that space is Nature Human Behavior, right? I think that they do a great job of kind of keeping on top of this kind of modeling of social media and disinformation information. So I think that's a good venue to publish in. Also, we published some of this work on if you're using the agent-based modeling method, right? We publish in our journal a lot called JAS, which I'd be remiss if I didn't mention because I'm on the editorial board for it. It's the Journal of Artificial Societies and Social Simulations, right? It's not quite reaching. It's going to reach other agent-based modelers. It's not going to reach social scientists per se, right? But there's a lot of social scientists who are interested in computational modeling who read that journal. So those two I'd mention off the top of my head. The bot detection paper is actually coming out in, I can't remember, it's computational statistics and data analysis, primarily because my co-authors are all stats people and they need to publish in those locations, right? I'm luckily being a full professor, I don't have to really worry about where I'm publishing as much anymore, right? So I can just let them choose. But those, Nature Human Behavior is one I've been eyeing quite a bit. I think it's a great location for this kind of work for sure.
Thank you.
Let me follow up on that since we're in the topic of behavioral implications. I think social sciences will be very much interested in the implication for behavior. For example, how does information actually change, voting behavior pattern, whether or not people actually change, how they vote. We're still in the middle of the midterm election in terms of waiting for the results. So that's one question. Whether it's just a perpetuating message in an echo chamber, it's a much more isolated in bubbles, or they actually spread to other groups and actually change people's mind.
Yeah, no, I think there's been some good evidence that you can, in fact, pull people out of these echo chambers, right? So, if it kind of depends on what you're thinking about in that space, right? So the voting one, I just have to mention this. There's a famous study that was done where Facebook, and now potentially there's some ethical issues around this study, so I'll put that out front, right? But Facebook has shown pretty convincingly that when people put the little I voted button on their Facebook and they share it, that it actually affects other people, that other people are more likely to vote. And they did that through a controlled study where they made some of those messages appear more in certain areas than others, right? And as a result, they were able to show they were able to increase voter turnout in areas where Facebook decided they should increase. Now, they claim it was just random controlled study. It wasn't really meant to, they weren't trying to cause votes, right? They were just curious if it would, right? They showed that they could. So it's not really breaking people out of echo chambers, but the idea that these social media channels the platforms themselves can manipulate people's actions, essentially, is what I'm trying to get at, right? And so it is possible if you had a very altruistic social media company to kind of break down some of these. Now, the other thing I would point to, and I point to the game, right, that I mentioned earlier on where you kind of learn how to play as a social media adversary, right? And I'm going to post it into the comments real quick because the link to the URL. So it's called Get Bad News, right? And in this case, you play a game where you perpetuate the idea of fake news, right? Like you're trying to become an adversary yourself. And they actually did a study that was published where they showed that, in fact, having people just play this game breaks them out of spreading fake news, right? People who play this game are less likely to spread fake news in the future, right? And so I think that's a great example of where people have actually used the tools of social media to kind of reform social media users, right? And I'm trying to find, they had a scientific article. I'm trying to find the link to it real quick, and I can post it in. But they did a study about this and show that you can inoculate users, right, against fake news. Not finding it. Yeah, there it is. Good news about bad news. That's where it is. So here's the article that relates to that. So there's the article, and then the original URL for the game itself is right here. So those are two, it's off the top of my head. I think it is possible to break people out of these echo chambers. It's maybe not easy, but it's possible.
Yeah. Okay, so going back to your the first half of your presentation, do you actually have the technology to detect the sources of this misinformation? Who are behind the bots?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Twitter's not obvious. It doesn't list all of its methods, right? Because obviously it doesn't want to, because then people can combat those methods more easily, right? So we know Twitter is doing this to some extent, right? We know that the NSA, for instance, at times has disrupted these kinds of events at critical times. That's come out after the fact, right? So during the 2018 elections, we're pretty sure that during the 2020 elections, we're pretty sure the NSA took actions to make sure that there was less disruption of what was going on, right? So some people can, right? I guess is what I'm getting at. How much of that has been scientifically shown, scientifically proven? You're right. It's not a lot right now, but there's some good evidence that we can at least detect it and start to combat it at this point.
Yeah.
So it looks like there's a question in the chat from Brian. Is there a method to get a sense of groups of people on social media thoughts, either before being subjected to adversarial social media or just what their baseline is? So sensing what people believe before they're subjected to these ideas. That's an interesting idea. So there's a bunch of tools out there that are revolved around social media monitoring, right? Brandwatch, as an example, that pops to head, Hootsuite, TweetDeck. What you could do is potentially look to see what they had posted on beforehand. So that's kind of related to the question that we're working on right now, which is, can we detect people who are likely to interact with bots before they interact with bots, right? And one of the things we're looking at in that space is what kind of content are they posting on, right? And we're finding that that can be indicative of what makes them more likely to interact with bots in the future. We don't have any concrete findings there right now, but we're working on that for sure. Yeah.
Okay. We are also interested in the policy implications.
Yep.
So who are actually in charge, if anyone is, of policing the spread of this misinformation? And do we need, this process to be institutionalized at some level?
We there is no one officially in charge, right? That's one of the questions I would say, right? The part of the problem is that the social media platforms are labeled as technology companies and not labeled as publishing companies, right? If they were labeled as publishing companies, right, then there's a certain set of law that would come into place that would require them to do a better job of policing their own behavior, right? But because they're listed as technology companies, this gets into a little bit of a tricky legal part, but there's something called the Communications Decency Act, and it has a section called Section 230 that is very famous. And Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act essentially says that any internet provider and any internet platform is not responsible for the content on its platform, but the user who posted the content is responsible for it, right? And so what that means is Facebook can't be held accountable for something leading to, say, a riot that kills people, right? Only the individual users who post that content are liable for it, right? Now, there's been a lot of conversation, interestingly enough, on both the left and the right of the United States political spectrum about changing that section, right? The left side, because they feel like there's a lot of hatred and violence that essentially is perpetrated by social media, by Section 230. On the right side, right, the other aspect of it is that this allows social media companies to censor individuals, right? So removing Trump from Twitter, for instance, right? And so removing that might make them unable to do things like that, right? And so the right is also interested in potentially removing Section 230. It'll be interesting to see how it goes forward. Right now, there's a lot of interest. I would say the number one source of work in this space is coming out of the military, honestly, right? The NSA is funding a lot of research in this space. DARPA has been funding research in this space to promote sound, and they do it under the guy, one of the jobs of the military is to protect the elections of the United States and make sure they're free and clear, right? And so preventing social media misinformation is something that they think of as their responsibility as a result, right? And I'm not sure that's what we want, right? We probably want more, regulation and agency at a different level, besides just the military interventions going after and protecting social media conversations.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? We are already in overtime right now, and you've been very generous with your time, Bill. We try not to abuse that.
No worries at all.
Anyone wants to ask the last question?
Well, thank you all for the time
Thank
today.
you.
It's been a lot of fun for sure, and I enjoyed it. Thanks for the great questions. I look forward to hearing, if you have any additional thoughts, you can always email me, wmrand@ncsu.edu. I'm happy to respond to things there. So thank you all.
Thank you. Everyone, please join me in giving Bill a big round of applause. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Awesome. All right.
Well, thanks, Yuri. Thanks for this.
Thank you.
This is fun.
Oh, yeah. Pleasure is all ours. Thank you, Bill.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah. I hope everything's going okay with your own agent-based modeling stuff.
Yeah, I started to go back to doing that. I actually was learning machine learning,
Okay.
for a while. I didn't got one paper out of it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm gonna go back to ABM at some point.
Yeah. Well, I think they're very complementary. I use both of them, as you can see from this talk too.
Yes.
So, right. So.
Yeah.
Take care. I'll talk to you
You
soon,
too.
hopefully. Yep. Bye.
Bye.